Hello, and welcome back to History to Relax. Wherever you are in the world right now, I invite you to make yourself completely comfortable. Go ahead and adjust your pillows, pull the blankets up a little higher, and let the weight of the day simply melt away into the mattress beneath you. Take a slow, deep breath in and let it all the way out. Before we begin our journey tonight, I just want to take a brief moment to thank you for being here. If you enjoy our time together and find these stories helpful for winding down, please consider liking this episode and subscribing to the podcast. It costs absolutely nothing, takes only a second, but it does wonders to help keep the podcast going and growing. And if you're in a position to do so and would like to support the show directly, you can leave a little tip over at ko-fi.com/history to relax. Your support means the world, and it helps me keep these stories coming to you night after night. Now, let your eyes softly close. Let your breathing settle into a natural, easy rhythm. Tonight, we're going to travel back in time and across the vast, dark ocean to explore one of the most unusual, surreal, and deeply human stories in modern history. This is the story of Liberia. To understand the sheer strangeness of how Liberia came to be, we have to start not in the lush, humid rainforests of West Africa, but in a place completely different. We have to start in the damp, freezing winters of Washington, D.C. in the early 1800s. Picture the American capital as it was back then. It wasn't the city of shining white marble monuments and neatly paved avenues that we know today. It was, quite frankly, a swamp. The streets were made of thick, clinging mud. Politicians rode on horseback through deep puddles, their boots caked in dirt. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and cheap cigars. It was a young, messy country, still trying to figure out exactly what it was going to become. And in the winter of 1816, inside a dimly lit tavern called the Davis Hotel, a very strange meeting took place. If you had walked into that tavern, shook off the snow, and looked around the room, you would have seen a group of men who, under any other circumstances, would absolutely despise each other. On one side of the room, you had passionate, deeply religious abolitionists, men from the North who believed with every fiber of their being that slavery was a moral stain, an evil that needed to be erased from the earth. And sitting right across from them, sharing the same roaring fire and drinking the same ale, were wealthy Southern plantation owners. Men who not only owned enslaved people, but were terrified of the very idea of freedom for Black Americans. It was a political paradox. It was as if cats and mice had suddenly decided to form a committee. And yet, there they were, nodding in agreement, united by a single, peculiar idea. They formed an organization called the American Colonization Society. And their grand, unbelievable plan was simply this. They were going to raise money, buy ships, and send free Black Americans across the Atlantic Ocean back to Africa. Now, history is full of bad ideas, but the sheer absurdity of this one is almost hard to wrap your head around. Let's look at the logic, or rather, the complete lack of it. For the Southern enslavers, the logic was rooted in fear. By the early 1800s, there was a growing population of free black men and women living in the United States. To the plantation owners, this was terrifying. A free, successful black population was a walking, breathing contradiction to the entire system of slavery. They thought, if we just send the free people far away, the problem disappears, out of sight, out of mind. But for the Northern abolitionists, the logic was oddly well-intentioned, yet completely misguided. They looked around at the deeply ingrained prejudice in American society and decided, rather pessimistically, that black and white people could simply never live together in peace. They thought they were doing a noble thing. They thought they were offering a ticket to a promised land, a place where free black Americans could build their own society, free from the crushing weight of American racism. And so, this bizarre alliance shook hands. They even got the United States government involved. Prominent figures, men whose faces are now carved into stone and printed on currency, like James Monroe, Andrew Jackson, and Henry Clay, threw their support and their money behind the project. But there was one massive, glaring flaw in this grand design. A flaw so obvious, it's almost comical, that these highly educated men in Washington failed to see it. The people they were planning to send back to Africa were not from Africa. By the year 1820, the vast majority of free black Americans had been born in the United States. Their parents had been born in the United States. In many cases, their grandparents had been born in the United States. They spoke English. They practiced Christianity. They wore American clothes, ate American food, and understood the world through a distinctly American lens. Africa wasn't home. Africa was a vast, mysterious continent thousands of miles away, a place they had only ever heard about in old stories passed down in whispers. Telling a free black man in Philadelphia in 1820 to go back to Africa made about as much sense as telling a white politician in Washington to go back to a random village in medieval England. When the American Colonization Society started pitching their idea, trying to recruit passengers for this grand voyage, the reaction from the free black communities in cities like Philadelphia and New York was swift, and it was loud. They held massive public meetings. They stood on wooden stages and delivered fiery, passionate speeches. They effectively said, "We built this country. Our sweat is in the soil. We fought in your wars. We are Americans. We are not going anywhere." And for the most part, the plan was a colossal failure. Out of the hundreds of thousands of free black Americans living in the country, the society only ever managed to convince a tiny fraction to actually make the journey. But they did convince some. Some were swayed by the romanticized promises of the society's pamphlets, which described West Africa as an absolute paradise, a Garden of Eden where the soil was perfectly fertile and the rivers flowed with golden opportunity. Others were simply exhausted. They were tired of the constant, grinding prejudice of American life. They were tired of walking down the street and feeling like second-class citizens. To them, stepping onto a wooden ship and sailing off the edge of the known world, braving the terrifying unknown, somehow felt safer than staying in the country of their birth. And so, the money was raised, the supplies were bought, the ships were chartered. In the bitter cold of winter, a ship called the Elizabeth sat bobbing in the icy waters of New York Harbor. It was a sturdy wooden vessel, but looking at it against the vast gray expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, it must have seemed impossibly small. 88 men, women, and children walked up the wooden gangplank. They carried with them everything they owned, packed into heavy wooden trunks. They brought Bibles, tools, seeds, and clothes meant for a New England winter, completely unaware of the blistering heat that awaited them. As they stood on the deck, feeling the deck shift beneath their feet, they looked back at the skyline of New York. The heavy ropes were untied. The massive canvas sails caught the winter wind, snapping taut with a sound like a rifle crack. Slowly, the ship pulled away from the dock. The familiar shoreline began to shrink, fading into a thin, hazy line on the horizon. The water turned from the murky brown of the harbor to the deep, endless, rolling indigo of the open sea. They were leaving behind the only world they had ever known. And they were sailing entirely blind into the deep blue, toward a coastline they could not even begin to imagine. The shoreline was gone. Where there had once been the bustling, muddy reality of the American coast, There was now only a sharp, flat line separating the grey winter sky from the deep, rolling indigo of the Atlantic Ocean. For the 88 men, women and children standing on the wooden deck of the Elizabeth, the world had suddenly shrunk. It was no longer a vast continent of sprawling cities and endless farms. Their entire universe was now confined to a wooden vessel, barely 100 feet long, suspended between the clouds and the crushing depths of the sea. As the days turned into weeks, a strange, hypnotic rhythm settled over the ship. When you were traveling by sail in the 1820s, time doesn't work the way we are used to. There are no engines roaring, no updates on a screen telling you how many miles remain, no way to rush the journey. You are entirely at the mercy of the wind and the currents. Some days, the breeze would catch the massive canvas sails perfectly, pulling them taut and pushing the ship forward with a satisfying, steady speed. On those days, the ship would carve through the water, leaving a bubbling trail of white foam in its wake. The wooden hull would hum, a low, constant vibration that you could feel in the soles of your feet. But then there were the calm days. The days when the wind simply died, as if the ocean had suddenly forgotten to breathe. During these lulls, the Elizabeth would just sit there, drifting aimlessly beneath a massive, empty sky. The sails would hang limp and useless against the masts. The only sounds were the slow, lazy creaking of the timber, the rhythmic slap of the water against the side of the hull, and the soft voices of the passengers echoing across the deck. For a podcast designed to help you relax, those quiet, windless days on the open ocean might sound incredibly peaceful. But for the people living them, staring out at the endless blue horizon with absolutely nothing to do, the boredom must have been profound. To pass the time, they fell into a daily routine, establishing a tiny, floating village. In the mornings, as the sun broke over the eastern horizon, painting the clouds in shades of peach and bruised purple, the passengers would emerge from the cramped, dimly lit quarters below deck. They would stretch their legs, breathe in the sharp, salty air, and go about their chores. The women mended clothes, their needles flashing in the sunlight, trying to repair garments that were never designed for a sea voyage. The men checked the heavy wooden trunks strapped to the deck, making sure the ropes were tight, protecting the precious tools and seeds they had brought with them to build a new world. The children, incredibly, played. They ran around the labyrinth of ropes and barrels, turning the deck of the ship into a playground, completely unfazed by the thousands of miles of water beneath them. It was a deeply human scene, floating in the middle of nowhere. Yet, beneath the surface of this daily routine, there was a quiet, collective anxiety. You have to remember what these people had packed in those heavy wooden trunks. They had packed for the world they knew. They brought thick, heavy wool coats, sturdy leather boots lined with fur, and dense cotton blankets to keep out the bitter chill of a northern winter. They had packed for snow and sleet. The American Colonization Society had handed them beautifully printed pamphlets describing Africa as a sort of paradise. But these politicians in Washington hadn't exactly been truthful about the climate. They hadn't mentioned the humidity. They hadn't mentioned that the coast of West Africa sits right near the equator. As the Elizabeth sailed further south and further east, leaving the icy waters of the North Atlantic behind, the climate began to shift. It was subtle at first. The sharp bite of the winter wind softened into a mild, pleasant breeze. Then, a few days later, the air grew noticeably warmer. Soon, the heavy wool coats were abandoned. The dense blankets were folded up and shoved to the bottom of the trunks. By the third week, the heat had become a physical presence on the ship. The sun beat down on the wooden deck relentlessly, turning the tar between the floorboards soft and sticky. The air grew thick and heavy with moisture, tasting of salt and warm rain. Down in the sleeping quarters, the air was stifling, forcing many of the passengers to drag their bedding up to the main deck at night, preferring to sleep under the open sky. And what a sky it was! As they drifted further away from the northern hemisphere, the night sky began to change, slowly unveiling a completely different tapestry of stars. The familiar constellations they had known their entire lives, the ones that had guided sailors and farmers for centuries in America, began to dip lower and lower on the horizon, eventually disappearing entirely. In their place, strange, bright new clusters of stars emerged from the dark. They saw the Southern Cross rising in the sky, a brilliant, diamond-like formation that confirmed just how far they had traveled from home. Laying on the wooden deck at night, looking up at a sky full of stars they didn't recognize, listening to the gentle, rhythmic rocking of the ship, it must have felt like they had left the Earth entirely and were sailing through space. It was a profound, humbling reminder of the sheer scale of the world and how incredibly small their wooden ship was within it. But it wasn't always peaceful. The ocean is a temperamental host. There were nights when the sky would bruise a deep, angry purple, and the wind would suddenly howl through the rigging like a wild animal. The Elizabeth would pitch and roll, climbing massive black walls of water, hanging suspended at the crest for a terrifying second, before plunging down into the trough of the next wave. During these storms, the passengers huddled below deck in the dark, listening to the violent crashing of the water, the terrifying groan of the timber fighting to hold together, and the shouting of the sailors above. They held on to each other, praying over the noise, wondering if the ocean would simply swallow them whole. But storms on the sea, much like storms in life, eventually pass. The wind would exhaust itself, the clouds would break, and the morning sun would reveal a calm, glassy ocean, as if the violence of the night before had never happened. The ship had survived. They had survived. Weeks turned into a month. The fresh food they had brought from New York was long gone. They were living entirely on the monotonous, heavily salted rations of a 19th century sailor. Hardtack biscuits that could break a tooth, salted pork that had to be soaked for hours just to be edible, and water from wooden barrels that had begun to taste stale and warm. The initial excitement of the departure had completely worn off, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. The sheer vastness of the ocean had become oppressive. They were suspended in a blue purgatory, disconnected from their past and unable to see their future. And then one morning, everything changed. It didn't start with a sight. It started with a smell. Before anyone even saw the coastline, the wind shifted, carrying a scent across the water that they hadn't experienced in over 40 days. It was the rich, heavy smell of damp earth, crushed leaves, and blooming flowers. It was the unmistakable, deeply grounding scent of land. The water around the ship began to change color. The deep, crystal-clear indigo of the open ocean faded, mixing with a murky, nutrient-rich green. Seagulls and strange, brightly colored coastal birds began to circle the masts, calling out to each other. The passengers crowded against the wooden railings, their eyes straining against the glare of the morning sun. For a long time, there was nothing but the hazy line where the water met the sky. Then, slowly, a shadow began to form on the horizon. It wasn't a sharp, clear image at first. It looked like a low, dark cloud resting on the water. But as the wind pushed the Elizabeth closer, the cloud began to resolve itself. The soft edges sharpened. The grey haze gave way to a brilliant, almost blinding explosion of color. It was a solid wall of absolute, unbroken green. Massive, towering trees reached into the sky, their branches tangled with thick, hanging vines. The coastline was wrapped in a dense, humid mist, making the jungle look wild, ancient, and entirely impenetrable. As they drew closer, they could hear the low, rhythmic roar of the surf crashing against a bright, sandy beach. The 88 passengers stood in absolute silence, staring at the landmass before them. This was it. This was the mythical continent of their ancestors. This was the place the politicians in Washington had promised would be a paradise. But looking at the incredibly dense, raw, unforgiving jungle stretching out before them, it didn't look like the neatly manicured farms of Pennsylvania or the rolling hills of Virginia. It looked completely alien. They had survived the deep blue. But as the heavy iron anchor was finally dropped, plunging into the warm, murky water with a massive splash, a sobering realization washed over the deck. The journey across the ocean was over, but the true struggle, the surreal and incredibly difficult task of surviving in this new world, was only just beginning. The heavy iron anchor plunged into the warm, murky water with a massive splash, sending a shockwave of white foam across the surface. The thick chain rattled violently against the wooden hull, a harsh metallic sound that seemed entirely out of place against the quiet, ancient backdrop of the West African coastline. Then the chain pulled taut. The Elizabeth groaned, shifted her weight, and finally sat still. For the first time in over a month, the constant, rhythmic forward motion of the ship simply stopped. If you've ever spent a long time on a boat, you know the strange sensation that follows. Your body is so used to constantly adjusting to the roll of the waves that when the floor finally stops moving, the stillness actually makes you feel dizzy. The 88 passengers stood gripping the wooden railings, their legs trembling slightly, staring out at the solid wall of emerald green that loomed just a few hundred yards away. This was the Pepper Coast. It earned that name centuries earlier from European sailors who came looking for a very specific, incredibly valuable spice called the Melegueta pepper, or as they romantically called it, the grains of paradise. But to the exhausted men and women standing on the deck of the Elizabeth, this place did not look like paradise. It looked beautiful, certainly, but in a wild, intimidating, and completely untamed way. Slowly, the sailors began to lower the small wooden rowboats into the water. The passengers climbed down the rope ladders, their heavy boots slipping on the wet rungs, and huddled together as the sailors rowed them toward the shore. As the small boats glided over the crashing surf and the wooden hulls finally scraped against the bright, coarse sand of the beach, they stepped out. They had finally made it. They had crossed the ocean, but the moment their boots touched the soil of Africa, any romantic illusions they had about a joyous, welcoming homecoming evaporated into the thick, tropical air. The first thing that hit them wasn't the scenery. It was the heat. It wasn't the kind of heat they were used to during a brief New York summer. This was an equatorial heat. It was heavy, wet, and deeply oppressive. It felt as though someone had wrapped the entire coastline in a thick, steaming, wet wool blanket. The air was so saturated with moisture that breathing almost felt like drinking. Within minutes of standing on the beach, their heavy, multi-layered 19th century American clothing, the stiff canvas trousers, the high-collared linen shirts, the heavy cotton dresses, were completely soaked through with sweat. Imagine the sheer, heartbreaking absurdity of the scene. Here were people who had packed for a life they understood. Somewhere in the dark belly of the ship, waiting to be unloaded, were heavy cast-iron stoves meant for chilly autumn mornings. There were wool coats meant to keep out the biting frost. There were grandfather clocks and fine china teacups, and they were standing on a blindingly bright beach, flanked by towering palm trees and dense mangrove swamps, baking inside clothes designed for a completely different hemisphere. If they had thought the voyage across the deep blue was the hardest part of their journey, the jungle quickly introduced them to a chaotic, entirely new reality. As they moved away from the breeze of the ocean and took their first cautious steps toward the tree line, the silence of the sea was instantly replaced by the deafening roar of the rainforest. The jungle was alive, and it was loud. There was the constant, high-pitched hum of millions of insects, a vibrating sound that seemed to bore directly into their skulls. There were the sudden, sharp cries of brightly colored tropical birds echoing through the canopy, and the rustling of unseen creatures moving through the thick underbrush. It was beautiful, but it was deeply alien. They didn't know the names of the trees. They didn't recognize a single flower. They couldn't tell which brightly colored fruits hanging from the branches were delicious and which were entirely poisonous. And then, out from the edges of the forest, came the people who actually lived there. This is perhaps the most surreal and awkward moment in the entire history of this grand experiment. The American Colonization Society back in Washington had sold this project on a very simple, very flawed premise. Send Black Americans back to Africa, and they will naturally fit right in. But when the newly arrived settlers came face to face with the local indigenous people, nations like the Dey, the Bassa, and the Kuru, who had lived on this land, traded on these rivers, and governed this coast for centuries, the culture shock was mutual, and it was profound. The locals stepped out onto the beach, looking at these newcomers with absolute bewilderment. From a distance, they might have shared a similar skin color, but the similarities ended the moment you looked any closer. The settlers were speaking English, a language with strange, harsh vowels. They were dressed in tight, restrictive, completely impractical Western clothing, sweating profusely and looking utterly miserable. They carried leather-bound Bibles and sang Protestant hymns. They didn't know the local customs, they didn't understand the local politics, and they had absolutely no idea how to survive in a tropical rainforest. To the indigenous people, these weren't long-lost brothers and sisters returning home. These were foreigners. They were completely alien settlers who had just washed up on their shores, carrying strangely shaped wooden boxes and looking completely out of their depth. For the settlers, the realization was a quiet, devastating heartbreak. They had left America because they were treated as outsiders, hoping to find a place where they finally belonged. But standing on that beach, staring at the local tribesmen, they realized a cold, hard truth. They were Americans. They were culturally, linguistically, and practically American. And here, in the land of their ancestors, they were just as much of an outsider as they had been back in Washington or Philadelphia. There was no grand welcome. There was only a cautious, highly suspicious standoff. The settlers had brought trade goods, brass pots, glass beads, rum and umbrellas, to negotiate for land. The local chiefs, who were incredibly shrewd businessmen used to trading with passing European ships, drove a hard bargain. They eventually agreed to lease the settlers a small, swampy, heavily wooded strip of land, far less than what the politicians in Washington had promised. But there was no time to argue. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, and they needed shelter. The initial attempts to build a settlement were a chaotic, stumbling exercise in trial and error. They brought out their heavy steel axes, the kind used to chop down pine and oak trees in New England, and swung them at the massive, iron-hard trunks of the tropical mahogany and rubber trees. The axes bounced off. The wood was so dense, so thick with sap, that their tools were practically useless. When they tried to clear the land for farming, they realized that the rich, dark soil they were used to didn't exist here. The tropical earth was thin, acidic, and easily washed away by the heavy rains. The seeds they had brought from America, the wheat, the corn, the apples, simply refused to grow in the suffocating heat and damp soil. They rotted in the ground before they could even sprout. And then, as if the jungle was trying to test the absolute limits of their endurance, the real threat arrived. Not from wild animals, and not from the local tribes, but from something so small they couldn't even see it. Mosquitoes. As dusk fell over the Pepper Coast, the air grew thick with them. In the 1820s, nobody knew that mosquitoes carried diseases. They thought illness came from bad air, from the miasma rising out of the swamps. And so, as the settlers slept under hastily built canvas tents, exhausted and homesick, they were bitten relentlessly. Within weeks, a terrifying silent wave swept through the small, muddy camp. They called it the African fever. Today, we know it as malaria. Because these settlers and their parents and their grandparents had been born in the United States, they had absolutely no natural immunity to the specific strains of malaria found in West Africa. The fever was brutal, and it was fast. It swept through the camp with a devastating indifference, turning their grand, hopeful experiment into a desperate struggle just to keep breathing. The nights were filled with the sounds of shivering, delirious prayers and the heartbreaking realization that this supposed paradise was actually a deeply dangerous frontier. As you lie there tonight, safe and comfortable in your own bed, try to imagine the sheer willpower it took to simply not give up. They were thousands of miles from the only home they had ever known. Their clothes were rotting off their backs in the humidity. Their food wouldn't grow. The locals viewed them with deep suspicion, and a terrifying, invisible fever was sweeping through their small, fragile community. Any reasonable person would have begged the next passing ship to take them back, to return them to the devil they knew rather than face the nightmare they had just stepped into. But they didn't leave. Perhaps it was stubbornness. Perhaps it was pride. Or perhaps it was the simple, profound fact that going back meant returning to a society that told them they were less than human. Here, in the mud and the heat and the fever, they were suffering, yes. But they were suffering on their own terms. They were free. As the sun set on those early, desperate months, casting long, dark shadows through the dense canopy of the jungle, the survivors gathered around small, smoky fires. They listened to the terrifying, chaotic symphony of the African night, a wall of sound that reminded them every single second of how far from home they were. They had survived the ocean. They were surviving the fever. But as they looked around at the mud, the dense vines, and their rotting canvas tents, they realized that if they were going to stay, they couldn't just survive. They had to build a nation, and in a true testament to the strange, stubborn nature of humanity, they decided they were going to build the only kind of nation they knew how. They were going to build America, right here in the jungle. When human beings are pushed to the absolute edge of their endurance, when everything around them is terrifying and unfamiliar, we have a very deeply ingrained psychological instinct. We cling to what we know. We try to recreate the familiar, because the familiar feels safe. It is a defense mechanism against the chaos of the unknown. And for the survivors of those first brutal years on the Pepper Coast, the only world they knew how to recreate was the very world that had rejected them. Think about the sheer, monumental effort this required. The settlers didn't just decide to pitch a few tents and adapt to the rhythms of the West African landscape. They looked at the towering mahogany trees, the dense, suffocating vines, and the muddy, uneven ground, and they decided to conquer it. They were determined to impose straight, orderly lines onto a wilderness that thrived on wild, chaotic growth. First, they needed a name. The land they had purchased, or rather strong-armed from the local chiefs with the backing of a United States Navy warship that happened to anchor offshore, needed an official title. They called the territory Liberia, derived from the Latin word for free. It was a beautiful, hopeful name. It sounded like a promise, but then they had to name their new capital settlement. And here is where the strange, bitter irony of this whole experiment really begins to reveal itself. These were men and women who had crossed an ocean to escape the crushing oppression of the American South. Yet, when it came time to name their new home, they chose to honor one of the principal backers of the American Colonization Society. They named the muddy, sweltering little town Monrovia after James Monroe. James Monroe, the sitting President of the United States. A man who, back across the ocean, personally enslaved dozens of human beings on his Virginia plantation. It is a jarring contradiction, but it perfectly captures the deeply complicated, tangled psychology of the settlers. They were desperately trying to prove to the white politicians back in Washington, and perhaps more importantly to themselves, that they were civilized, that they were capable of building a modern, functioning Western society. And so, the building began. If you had sailed down the coast of West Africa a few years later and anchored off the shores of Monrovia, you would have rubbed your eyes in absolute disbelief. As you took a rowboat to the shore and walked up the hill away from the beach, the dense jungle suddenly gave way to a clearing. And sitting in the middle of that clearing was what looked exactly like a small town in Georgia or the Carolinas, inexplicably dropped onto the equator. The settlers had completely ignored the architectural wisdom of the indigenous people. The local tribes built homes that breathed. They used woven palm fronds, lightweight bamboo, and open circular designs that allowed the constant, heavy heat to escape and caught whatever faint breeze came off the ocean. Their homes worked in harmony with the extreme climate. The America or Liberians, as the settlers began to call themselves, wanted absolutely nothing to do with that. To live in a woven hut was, in their minds, a step backward. It was a surrender to the wilderness. Instead, they built massive, heavy houses out of brick and thick-cut timber. They built pitched roofs designed to shed heavy winter snow, even though the temperature here never dropped below 70 degrees. They built homes with narrow, glass-paned windows that trapped the sweltering heat inside like an oven. They constructed deep, wraparound verandas supported by grand, white-painted wooden columns, mimicking the sprawling plantation houses they had seen, and in many cases worked on, back in the American South. Inside these houses, the air was stifling. The heavy wood warped and groaned in the constant humidity. Termites, a relentless and invisible army in the tropical soil, constantly gnawed at the foundations. Everything made of leather grew a fine, fuzzy layer of green mold within days. And yet, inside those sweltering, rotting wooden walls, the settlers stubbornly arranged heavy, imported oak dining tables, ticking grandfather clocks, and velvet-lined chairs. It was an architectural rebellion against the reality of their environment. But the most striking, almost surreal visual of early Monrovia wasn't the houses. It was the clothing. Imagine, for a moment, the physical sensation of stepping outside on a July afternoon in an equatorial rainforest. The humidity is sitting at around 95%. The sun is a blinding white-hot weight pressing down on your shoulders. The simple act of standing still makes you sweat. Now imagine walking out into that heat wearing the standard formal fashion of the mid-19th century American middle class. For the men, this meant thick cotton undergarments, a stiff, high-collared linen shirt buttoned tight against the throat, a heavy waistcoat, and a tailored wool coat that fell down to the knees. On their heads, they wore dark, felt top hats. Around their necks, silk cravats pulled tightly into precise knots. For the women, it was even more punishing. They wore heavy, restrictive corsets pulled tight, layered under thick cotton chemises, petticoats, and long, sweeping dresses, made of broadcloth or dark velvet that dragged through the red, muddy streets of the town. They must have been in absolute, agonizing physical discomfort. The starch in their collars would melt away into a soggy mess within minutes of stepping off their porches. The wool coats must have felt like heavy, suffocating blankets. Their boots, designed for the paved sidewalks of Philadelphia, sank deep into the squelching mud of the rainy season. The local indigenous people, who sensibly wore very little in the crushing heat, utilizing light, breathable fabrics wrapped around their waists, looked at the settlers as if they had completely lost their minds. Why on earth would anyone wrap themselves in heavy animal wool in the middle of a jungle? But to understand why the Americo-Liberians refused to take off their wool coats, you have to understand what those coats represented. The clothing was not about comfort. It was psychological armor. It was a deeply held defense mechanism. Back in the United States, the way you dressed was an immediate, visual indicator of your social class, your freedom, and your humanity. By dressing in the height of Western fashion, the settlers were drawing a thick, visible line in the sand between themselves and the indigenous tribes surrounding them. Taking off the top hat, loosening the collar, or abandoning the corset felt like a terrifying slip down a steep slope. They believed that if they gave in to the heat, if they adapted to the jungle, they would lose their identity. They would cease to be civilized Americans and would be swallowed whole by the vast, wild continent. The heavy wool and the tight corsets were quite literally the boundaries of their civilization. They would rather suffer heat stroke than be seen as anything less than proper, refined ladies and gentlemen. And so they sweated. They sweated through Sunday church services, standing in wooden pews, singing Methodist and Baptist hymns while fanning themselves desperately with palm leaves. They sweated through formal afternoon teas, serving imported British biscuits on china plates that had managed to survive the ocean crossing. They sweated through town hall meetings, debating property laws and trade regulations using the formal, flowery political language of Washington, D.C. A strange, hauntingly beautiful soundscape began to emerge in the settlement. If you closed your eyes on a Sunday morning in Monrovia in the 1840s, you would hear a sound that was utterly unique in the world. Drifting through the thick, humid air, over the rusted tin roofs and the wooden verandas, came the sound of a church choir. They were singing old, familiar American spirituals and Protestant hymns. The voices were rich, carrying the deep emotional weight of everything they had survived. But wrapping around that music, competing with it, was the wild, untamed symphony of the African rainforest. The rhythmic, soaring harmonies of the choir would be punctuated by the sudden shrieking calls of monkeys in the canopy, just a few hundred yards away. The polite ringing of a brass church bell would echo alongside the distant, low vibrating hum of millions of cicadas. It was the sound of two completely different worlds, sitting side by side, yet stubbornly refusing to blend. The Americo-Liberians had done exactly what they set out to do. Against impossible odds, against disease, crop failure, and a completely alien environment, they had carved a miniature replica of America out of the wilderness. In 1847, they made it official. They drafted a Declaration of Independence that sounded remarkably similar to the one written by Thomas Jefferson. They created a constitution that established a Senate, a House of Representatives, and a president. They designed a flag with red and white stripes and a single white star on a blue square. They had built their mirror. But mirrors are dangerous things. Because a mirror doesn't just reflect the good parts of what you place in front of it. A mirror reflects absolutely everything. It reflects the flaws, the cracks, and the deepest, darkest imperfections. In their desperate attempt to recreate the society they had left behind, the settlers inadvertently recreated the exact same social dynamics that had oppressed them back in the United States. They had been treated as a permanent underclass in America. Now, having established their own country, they looked out at the vast indigenous population surrounding their little town of Monrovia. They didn't see brothers and sisters. They saw uneducated, uncivilized natives. The Americo-Liberians had built a beautiful, tragic, perfectly detailed replica of an American society. And slowly, quietly, they were about to step into the role of the masters. It is one of the most heartbreaking, deeply frustrating, and entirely predictable psychological loops in human history. When people who have been crushed at the very bottom of a social pyramid are suddenly given a blank slate and a chance to build a new world, they rarely draw a circle where everyone is equal. Instead, they almost always build another pyramid, and they make absolutely sure that this time they are the ones standing at the very top. But this transition didn't happen overnight. There was no grand cinematic battle where the Americo-Liberians suddenly conquered the indigenous nations. It happened slowly. It happened quietly. It was like watching a thick, creeping tropical vine slowly wrap itself around the trunk of a massive, ancient tree. Over years, and then decades, the vine simply tightens until the tree underneath can no longer breathe. To understand how this divide worked, you have to picture the map of Liberia in those early decades. If you were a bird flying high above the West African coast in the mid-1800s, you would look down and see a brilliant, unbroken emerald ocean of dense rainforest. But right on the edge of that green expanse, hugging the coastline where the waves crashed against the sand, there was a thin, fragile string of small towns. These were the settler towns: Monrovia, Buchanan, Greenville, Harper. They were tiny pockets of brick houses, white-painted churches, and muddy streets. Inside these little coastal bubbles lived the Americo-Liberians. They numbered only a few thousand people, but just a few miles inland, beyond the edge of the settler farms, the trees closed in. The dirt roads turned into narrow, winding footpaths. This was the deep interior, a vast, mysterious territory that was completely impenetrable to the Americans. And in that vast interior lived hundreds of thousands of indigenous people: the Bassa, the Grebo, the Crow, the Capelli, the Day, and many others. These indigenous nations were not lost, primitive tribes waiting to be discovered. They had rich, complex societies. They had ancient trade routes that snaked through the jungle for hundreds of miles. They had kings and chieftains, sophisticated systems of justice, and deeply spiritual connections to the land and the rivers. They had been trading gold, ivory, and spices with European ships for centuries before the first American boat ever dropped anchor. But from the porches of their brick houses in Monrovia, looking out toward the dark green wall of the jungle, the Americo-Liberians didn't see any of that. They looked at the indigenous people through the exact same lens of prejudice that white Americans had used to look at them. Because the indigenous people didn't speak English, didn't read the King James Bible, and didn't wear woolen suits in the boiling heat, the settlers labeled them as uncivilized heathens. And with that single, dismissive label, an invisible wall was built. It was a wall thicker and taller than any brick fortress they could have ever constructed. The settlers began to draft laws that actively excluded the native populations. In this new, supposedly free republic, The vast majority of the people living within its borders were not considered citizens. They were not allowed to vote in elections. They were not allowed to hold political office. They were effectively treated as foreigners in their own ancestral homeland. Imagine the sheer, surreal arrogance of it. A group of exhausted, seasick Americans wash up on a beach, claim the land for themselves, write a constitution in a language the locals don't understand, and then declare that the people who have lived there for 1,000 years are now illegal aliens. But the divide wasn't just political. It was deeply, intensely cultural, woven into the everyday fabric of life. In Monrovia, a bizarre new aristocracy began to take shape. The descendants of enslaved people, having finally escaped the plantations of the American South, began to mimic the behavior of the plantation owners they had fled. Because the tropical soil was so poor, and because the settlers fundamentally did not know how to farm the African land, their grand agricultural dreams quickly collapsed. They realized that if they were going to survive, they couldn't just grow their own food. They needed labor. They needed people to clear the dense brush, to carry the heavy loads of timber, and to work the small sugar and coffee plots they managed to carve out of the earth. And so, they turned to the interior. They began to employ indigenous people to do the heavy, back-breaking work. A stark, undeniable visual hierarchy emerged on the streets of the capital. If you walked through Monrovia on a Tuesday afternoon, you would see Americo-Liberian men, dressed in their dark, tailored suits, walking slowly down the street, holding walking sticks. Beside them, or walking just a few steps behind, would be an indigenous man or boy, barefoot, wearing only a simple cloth wrap, carrying the gentleman's heavy bags, or sometimes holding an umbrella over his head to shield him from the relentless beating sun. To the Americo-Liberian elite, having an indigenous servant was the ultimate status symbol. It was the absolute proof that they had made it, that they were finally respectable, that they were at last the ones in charge. The social ladder of this strange new country was rigid, and it had three very distinct rungs. At the very top, holding all the wealth, all the land deeds, and all the political power, were the Americo-Liberians. They spoke with a distinct, slightly Southern American drawl that sounded entirely out of place in West Africa. On the very bottom rung, making up over 95% of the population, were the indigenous African nations, who watched this tiny group of foreigners with a mixture of resentment, confusion, and deep suspicion. But there was a middle rung too, and this is where the story gets even more complicated. During the mid-1800s, the United States Navy and the British Royal Navy were actively patrolling the Atlantic Ocean, hunting down illegal slave ships. When they captured a ship, they couldn't exactly take the kidnapped people back to their specific villages, because they rarely knew exactly where they had been taken from. So, they would often sail to the nearest safe port and simply drop them off. Many of these intercepted ships were unloaded in Monrovia. The Americo-Liberians called these newly freed people Congos, assuming most of them came from the Congo River basin. The Congos were entirely displaced. They didn't speak the indigenous languages of the Liberian coast, but they also didn't speak the English of the American settlers. They were caught perfectly, tragically, in the middle. The Americo-Liberians viewed the Congos as slightly better than the indigenous people, because they could be civilized more easily, meaning they could be taught to wear Western clothes, go to Christian churches, and work in settler homes. So, you had a society of free people ruling over freed people, who were all ruling over the native people. It was a dizzying, incredibly fragile house of cards, built on a foundation of prejudice and deep lingering trauma. And holding this entire fragile structure together was a political machine, unlike any other in the world. In 1878, a political party came to power in Liberia. They called themselves the True Whig Party. Now, in most democracies, political parties win an election, govern for a few years, and eventually lose to the opposition. Power shifts, pendulums swing. But the True Whig Party didn't just win an election, they swallowed the country whole. Once they took control, they never let go. For over 100 straight years, from 1878 all the way to 1980, the True Whig Party ruled Liberia without a single interruption. It is one of the longest continuous periods of one-party rule in modern human history. They achieved this not through explosive violence, but through a quiet, gentlemanly, deeply corrupt system of patronage. They controlled all the wealth. They controlled all the government jobs. If you wanted to be a teacher, a judge, or a customs officer, you had to be a loyal member of the True Whig Party. And, crucially, only property owners could vote. Since the Liberians were the only ones who held official, government-recognized paper deeds to the land, they were the only ones who voted. Elections became a polite, formalized theater. The results were decided behind closed doors, in the dimly lit parlors of the grand houses in Monrovia, over glasses of imported brandy and the smoke of expensive cigars. For the vast majority of the people living in the deep green of the interior, the government in Monrovia was nothing more than a distant rumor. They lived their lives as they always had, governed by the rhythm of the rainy and dry seasons, honoring their ancestors and tending to their ancient forests. The only time the indigenous communities ever saw a representative of the Liberian government was when an armed tax collector hiked into their village, demanding a hut tax, a deeply resented fee charged simply for the privilege of living in their own homes. If a village couldn't pay the tax in silver coins, the government agents would sometimes take their young men instead, forcing them to work on government infrastructure projects or settler farms. It was a quiet, low-level hum of extortion, a slow, continuous taking of resources from the many to support the elegant lifestyle of the very few. As the 19th century slowly faded, giving way to the dawn of the 1900s, Liberia became a place trapped in amber. While the rest of the world was rapidly industrializing, building sprawling railroads, laying telegraph cables across oceans, and inventing machines that ran on oil and electricity, Liberia remained quietly, stubbornly isolated. The government in Monrovia was constantly broke. They were drowning in debt to European banks, struggling simply to keep their fragile country independent, while massive British and French colonial empires swallowed up the rest of the African continent around them. The Liberian elite sat on their rotting wooden verandas, listening to the relentless, heavy tropical rain drumming against their tin roofs. They wore their top hats, they went to their True Whig Party meetings, and they pretended, with every ounce of their willpower, that they were a thriving, modern republic. But beneath the surface of that polite illusion, the tension was building. The invisible war between the coast and the interior was groaning under its own weight. The world was changing. A new century had arrived, and far across the ocean, in the booming, smoke-filled factories of the American Midwest, the invention of a new machine was about to change the destiny of the Pepper Coast forever. It was a machine that didn't run on steam or coal. It ran on 4 inflated wheels. The age of the automobile had dawned, and to make those wheels turn, the world suddenly realized it needed an astronomical, almost incalculable amount of a very specific, milky white sap that only grew in tropical forests. They needed rubber. And as the executives of the largest tire company in the world rolled out their maps, running their fingers across the globe in search of land, their eyes settled on a small, deeply indebted republic on the coast of West Africa. To really grasp how the world shifted in the 1920s, you have to picture two completely different landscapes sitting thousands of miles apart. On one side of the ocean, you had the booming, smoke-filled, metallic noise of Detroit, Michigan. Henry Ford was rolling his Model T automobiles off the assembly lines by the millions. The American middle class was suddenly moving at 40 miles an hour. But a car without tires is just a very heavy, very useless metal box sitting in the mud. To keep the roaring 20s roaring, the automotive industry needed an astronomical supply of a thick, sticky, milky white sap called latex, which is tapped from the bark of the rubber tree. At the time, the global rubber market was tightly controlled by a massive British and Dutch monopoly. They had smuggled rubber seeds out of the Amazon rainforest decades earlier, planted them in their vast Asian colonies, and were now charging American companies an absolute fortune for the raw material. Enter a man named Harvey Firestone. Harvey Firestone was the head of the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, and he was absolutely furious about paying British prices. He famously declared that Americans should produce their own rubber. He just needed a place to grow it. It had to be a place with a tropical climate, heavy rainfall, and, ideally, a government that was desperate enough to give him exactly what he wanted. When Firestone's scouts looked at a map of the world, Liberia was a glaring, perfect target. Back across the ocean, the situation in Monrovia was incredibly grim. The true Whig Party, the Americo-Liberian elite who had ruled the country for decades, were completely broke. The government was drowning in debt to European banks. Even worse, the massive, heavily armed colonial empires of Great Britain and France were literally surrounding them. French and British troops would routinely cross into Liberian territory, move the border posts a few miles inward, and simply claim the land for themselves. Liberia had no army to stop them. They were terrified that their grand experiment in independence was about to be swallowed whole by European colonization. They needed money, and they needed a powerful American friend to keep the British and the French at bay. And so, in 1926, the Liberian government and the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company sat down and signed a piece of paper that would permanently alter the physical and social landscape of the country. The deal was staggering. It's almost hard to comprehend the sheer scale of it. The Firestone Corporation leased 1 million acres of Liberian land. To put that into perspective, that is roughly the size of the entire state of Rhode Island. They leased this massive chunk of a sovereign country for 99 years. And the price? 6 cents an acre. With the stroke of a pen, a single American corporation practically bought a country within a country. What happened next was a physical transformation so massive and violent that it fundamentally changed the very atmosphere of the Pepper Coast. If you want to plant 1 million acres of rubber trees, you first have to get rid of what is already there. For thousands of years, the Liberian interior had been a wild, chaotic, deeply complex rainforest. It was a dense tangle of ancient mahogany, twisted vines, bright tropical flowers, and a cacophony of animal life. It was unruly. It was wild. The Firestone managers arrived with axes, saws, and fire. They hired thousands of local men to hack down the ancient canopy. For months, the sky above the coast was choked with thick, grey smoke as they burned away the ancient underbrush. The wild, deafening symphony of the jungle was silenced, replaced by the crackle of burning timber and the sharp, rhythmic chopping of steel against wood. Once the ground was cleared, reduced to a flat expanse of dark, smoldering earth, the planting began. They planted a specific species of tree called Hevea brasiliensis. But they didn't just plant them randomly. They planted them in perfectly straight, agonizingly neat, mathematical lines. If you were to walk through the Firestone plantation in its prime, the visual effect was almost hypnotic. You could look down a row of trees and see a perfect, unbroken corridor stretching for miles. The grey trunks lined up like soldiers at attention. There were millions of them. The wild, chaotic green of Africa had been erased and replaced by a sterile, organized, highly profitable factory without a roof. A new, quiet rhythm settled over the land. Long before the sun came up, while the air was still cool and the morning mist clung to the ground, thousands of indigenous workers would walk into the endless geometric rows. They carried small, incredibly sharp knives. They would walk up to a tree and carefully score a thin diagonal line into the bark. They had to cut just deep enough to reach the sap, but not so deep that it would permanently damage the tree. At the bottom of the cut, they attached a small metal spout and placed a tiny ceramic cup beneath it. And then the dripping began, drop by drop by drop. A thick, bright white liquid would slowly bleed from the bark into the cup. Imagine the sound of that. Millions of tiny drops falling into millions of cups in the quiet, humid dawn. This was the liquid gold of the 20th century. This sticky white sap would be collected in heavy metal pails, poured into massive vats, processed with acid, rolled into sheets, and eventually shipped across the ocean to become the tires rolling down paved highways from New York to California. The Firestone plantation became a world entirely unto itself. They built a massive company town and named it Harville, combining the first names of Harvey Firestone and his wife, Idabel. Harville was an illusion of the American dream dropped onto the equator. The white American managers who came to run the plantation lived in beautiful, sprawling houses built on top of carefully manicured hills. They had running water, they had electricity, they had an immaculate green golf course where they would play 18 holes on Sunday afternoons, thousands of miles away from home. They had a country club with cold drinks and imported steaks. But down in the valleys, hidden away from the neat fairways of the golf course, were the labor camps. The indigenous Liberian men who actually tapped the trees lived in small, cramped, mud brick quarters. They worked long, grueling hours in the stifling heat for just a few pennies a day. You might wonder, how did Firestone convince tens of thousands of indigenous men to leave their ancestral villages, abandon their own farms, and spend their lives tapping trees for an American company? They didn't have to. The Americo-Liberian government did it for them. The politicians in Monrovia, the leaders of the true Whig Party, essentially acted as labor brokers. The government imposed a hut tax on the inland villages. The village chiefs had to pay a tax simply for the houses they lived in. And since the indigenous people didn't have a cash economy, the only way to pay the tax was to send their young men to work on the Firestone plantation. If a chief refused to supply the quota of men, the Liberian military would show up, burn the village, and take the men by force. It was a deeply cynical, quietly brutal system. The descendants of freed slaves were using the threat of violence to force the native population to work the land for the benefit of a foreign corporation. But for the Americo-Liberian elite, this era felt like an absolute golden age. With the massive influx of Firestone money, the Liberian government finally paid off its European debts. The threat of British and French invasion vanished, because now Liberia was backed by American corporate interests. Nobody was going to mess with Henry Ford's tire supply. A deep, comfortable, wealthy complacency settled over the capital city of Monrovia. This was the era of President William Tubman, a man who ruled Liberia for 27 years, right through the middle of the 20th century. If you looked at Liberia during the 1950s and 60s, it looked like a paradise of stability. President Tubman was a master of political theater. He was famous for his elegant top hats, his very expensive cigars, and his lavish, glamorous parties. He instituted what he called the open door policy, inviting foreign mining companies to come in and extract Liberia's massive reserves of iron ore. Suddenly, money was flowing into Monrovia like water. The coastal elite tore down their old, rotting wooden houses and built grand, modernist concrete mansions. They drove imported Mercedes-Benz cars down the newly paved streets. They sent their children to boarding schools in Switzerland and to Harvard and Oxford for university. The true Whig Party politicians attended grand, formalized balls, wearing white tuxedos and evening gowns, drinking French champagne and dancing to the latest jazz records imported from the States. They looked at their bank accounts. They looked at their beautiful coastal city, and they convinced themselves that they had finally succeeded. They believed they had built a modern, wealthy, deeply civilized nation, but it was a fragile, dangerous illusion. It was an illusion because all of that wealth, all of the champagne, the imported cars, and the university degrees stayed entirely within a tiny, closed circle on the coast. The Americo-Liberians still made up less than 5% of the total population. If you drove just an hour outside of Monrovia, past the neatly planted rows of the Firestone plantation, and went deep into the interior, time had essentially stood still. The roads turned back into dirt paths. There were no hospitals. There were no high schools. The indigenous communities were still living in profound, crushing poverty, watching the iron ore and the rubber being dragged out of their ancestral lands, while seeing absolutely none of the profits. The true Whig Party was sitting on top of a pressure cooker. They had screwed the lid on as tight as they possibly could. They controlled the military, they controlled the money, and they controlled the courts. They believed that the quiet, passive resistance of the indigenous population would simply last forever. They thought the status quo was permanent. But history is a very patient teacher. And history shows us that when you push a massive majority of people to the very margins of their own country, when you take their land and their labor while refusing to see them as equals, the pressure does not simply fade away. It builds, it compresses, it turns into a deep, vibrating, quiet anger. For 100 years, the true Whig Party had maintained this polite, deeply unequal society. They survived the 19th century. They survived the World Wars. They glided through the mid-20th century on a river of rubber and iron. But as the calendar pages slowly turned, bringing the world closer and closer to the year 1980, the comfortable illusion was about to shatter. The century-long party in Monrovia was coming to an end. And the wake-up call wasn't going to come from a foreign empire or a rival political party. It was going to come from a 28-year-old master sergeant who decided on one quiet, humid night that he had finally had enough. By the late 1970s, the capital city of Monrovia was a place of extreme, dizzying contrasts. If you walked down the main boulevards, you would see the glittering, mid-century modern architecture built by the Americo-Liberian elite. The true Whig Party government had constructed a massive, sprawling complex called the Executive Mansion. It was an imposing, brutalist structure of concrete and glass that sat right on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, designed to project absolute, unshakable power. Inside, the political class still wore their tailored suits, still drank imported scotch, and still believed they were completely untouchable. But if you walked just a few blocks away from the ocean breeze and into the crowded, sprawling neighborhoods where the indigenous and working-class populations lived, the atmosphere was entirely different. There were no paved roads here. There was no reliable electricity. The tin roofs rusted in the heavy tropical rains, and the air was thick with the smell of burning charcoal and diesel exhaust. The people living in these neighborhoods were the descendants of the vast indigenous nations. They were the ones who tapped the rubber trees, who carried the heavy loads at the shipping ports, and who served the dinners in the grand houses. And for over 100 years, they had been completely, systematically locked out of the political system of their own country. The tension in the air was no longer just a quiet hum. It was a physical, vibrating pressure. The economy was slowing down. The price of iron ore on the global market had dropped, meaning the government had less money to maintain their lavish lifestyles. And so, the government did what governments often do when they're running out of money and completely disconnected from the reality of their citizens. They made a terrible, deeply arrogant mistake. They decided to raise the price of rice. Now, in Liberia, rice is not just a side dish. It is the absolute, foundational staple of the diet. For a family living on the absolute margins of poverty, a sudden increase in the price of rice wasn't just an economic inconvenience. It was an existential threat. It meant hunger. And making matters infinitely worse, the rumor on the street was that the politicians in the true Whig Party, who owned the largest rice importing businesses in the country, were raising the prices simply to line their own pockets. In the spring of 1979, the invisible wall that had separated the elite from the masses finally cracked. Thousands of people poured into the streets of Monrovia. It wasn't a polite political rally. It was an explosion of a century's worth of repressed anger. They marched toward the executive mansion, demanding that the price of rice be lowered. The government, terrified and completely unaccustomed to being challenged, responded with the only tool they understood. They sent the police and the military to fire into the crowds. The rice riots, as they became known, broke the spell of the true Whig Party. The illusion of a peaceful, stable, gentlemanly republic was shattered into a million pieces on the asphalt of Monrovia. The elite retreated behind the heavy gates of the executive mansion, deeply shaken, but still believing they could eventually put the genie back in the bottle. They were wrong. A year later, in April of 1980, the heavy, humid night air of Monrovia was quiet. The Atlantic waves crashed rhythmically against the beach, a soothing, repetitive sound that had serenaded the coast for millennia. Inside the executive mansion, President William Tolbert, the latest in the long, unbroken line of Americo-Liberian leaders, was asleep. But down in the military barracks, a small group of soldiers was wide awake. They were led by a man named Samuel Canyon Doe. He was 28 years old, a master sergeant, and he was a member of the indigenous Kran ethnic group. He had a very limited formal education. He didn't speak the flowery, aristocratic political language of the true Whig Party. He, along with the 16 other indigenous soldiers with him that night, were vastly underpaid, poorly equipped, and entirely fed up with a system that treated them like second-class citizens, while they were the ones holding the rifles. They didn't have a grand, sophisticated geopolitical master plan. They didn't have the backing of a foreign intelligence agency. They were simply angry, and they had the element of absolute surprise. Under the cover of darkness, Master Sergeant Doe and his men quietly left their barracks. They moved through the empty streets, scaled the iron gates of the executive mansion, and disabled the guards. What happened inside those concrete walls that night was a sudden, violent severing of the timeline. The details of the physical confrontation are heavy, and we will step back from the raw edges of that violence. But the geopolitical result of that night was nothing short of an earthquake. By the time the sun came up over the Pepper Coast, painting the Atlantic Ocean in soft shades of pink and gold, the 130-year dominance of the Americo-Liberian elite was entirely wiped away. The true Whig Party, the political machine that had survived the 19th century and the world wars, was dissolved before breakfast. The citizens of Monrovia woke up, turned on their radios, and instead of hearing the usual smooth, polished voices of the government broadcasters, they heard the rough, unpolished voice of a 28-year-old soldier, speaking in heavy Liberian English, announcing that the government had been overthrown. The people who had been the servants were now in charge of the house. For a brief, fleeting moment, there was an explosion of absolute joy in the streets. The indigenous majority poured out of their homes, dancing, singing, and celebrating. For the very first time since the American settlers had washed up on the beach in 1822, a native African was the head of state in Liberia. To the vast majority of the country, it felt like a massive collective exhale. It felt like liberation. They believed that the pyramid of oppression had finally been dismantled. But history is rarely a simple story of liberation. Often, the architecture of power is so deeply ingrained in a place that even when you change the people at the top, the shape of the building remains exactly the same. Master Sergeant Doe had successfully torn down the old system, but he had absolutely no idea how to build a new one. He was a soldier, not an economist or a diplomat. He suddenly found himself sitting behind the massive wooden desk in the executive mansion, responsible for a complex national economy, international trade agreements, and a deeply fractured society. And so, the tragedy of the Liberian psychological loop repeated itself. Instead of drawing a circle where all of the indigenous nations were finally equal, Doe simply built a new pyramid. He surrounded himself exclusively with members of his own specific ethnic group, the Kron. He placed them in all the top military and government positions. The other indigenous groups, the Geo, the Mano, the Bassa, who had celebrated with him on the streets just months before, suddenly realized they were still standing on the bottom rung of the ladder. The only difference was the accent of the man standing at the top. The top hats, the tailcoats, and the velvet parlors of the old elites were gone. In their place came military fatigues, aviator sunglasses, and an atmosphere of raw, unfiltered paranoia. You might wonder how a 28-year-old master sergeant with no political experience managed to keep a country running, especially after violently overthrowing the established government. In any other era, his regime might have collapsed under its own weight within months. But Samuel Doe had the distinct, incredibly lucky timing of taking power in 1980. This was the absolute, freezing cold peak of the Cold War. Far across the ocean, in Washington, D.C., the United States government was locked in a massive global chess match with the Soviet Union. The Americans were looking at the map of Africa, watching nervously as Soviet influence spread through countries like Angola and Ethiopia. They desperately needed a fiercely loyal anti-communist ally on the West African coast. They needed a place to dock their warships, a place to land their military planes, and a place to build massive radio towers to broadcast American propaganda across the continent. They looked at Liberia, and they didn't care that Samuel Doe had overthrown the government. They didn't care about his domestic policies or his human rights record. They only cared that he was willing to be their friend. The result was one of the most surreal geopolitical partnerships of the 20th century. The United States opened a massive pipeline of money, pouring hundreds of millions of dollars directly into Samuel Doe's regime. If you look at photographs from the early 1980s, you can see the sheer, bizarre absurdity of this era. There are pictures of Samuel Doe, a man who just a few years earlier was sleeping in a hot, crowded military barracks, walking across the perfectly manicured lawn of the White House. He is shaking hands with President Ronald Reagan in the Oval Office. He was given weapons, military training, and massive financial grants. Liberia was transformed into a giant, heavily fortified listening post for the CIA. But the millions of dollars flowing into the country didn't go toward building schools in the deep interior or paving the dirt roads. The money went into buying the loyalty of the military, purchasing heavy weaponry, and building massive concrete sports stadiums in Monrovia to project an image of success. As the 1980s ground on, the initial joy of the indigenous population completely evaporated, replaced by a deep, creeping dread. The atmosphere in Monrovia became suffocating. Under the true Whig Party, the corruption had been polite and bureaucratic. Under Doe, it was heavily armed and deeply unpredictable. The military checkpoints multiplied. Dissidents and political rivals began to quietly disappear in the middle of the night. The economy, despite the massive influx of American money, was completely hollowed out by mismanagement. The infrastructure began to crumble. The historical distancing we talked about earlier is important here, because the day-to-day reality of living in Liberia during the late 80s was a constant, exhausting state of high anxiety. The government was deeply paranoid, constantly looking over its shoulder, searching for the next coup. Doe survived multiple assassination attempts, which only made him lock his grip on the country even tighter, punishing anyone who even whispered against him. But you cannot rule entirely through fear without creating ghosts, and one of those ghosts was about to return. While Samuel Doe was sitting in the executive mansion, watching his paranoia grow, a man who had once been a part of his own government, a man who had been accused of embezzling nearly $1 million and had dramatically escaped from a maximum security prison in Massachusetts, was quietly moving across the map. This man had spent the late 1980s wandering through West Africa, securing funding, making deeply questionable alliances, and eventually finding his way into the desert training camps of Libya, learning the dark, chaotic art of guerrilla warfare. He was gathering an army of the disenfranchised, the angry, and the forgotten. He was watching the cracks form in Samuel Doe's regime, and he was simply waiting for the perfect moment to strike a match and drop it onto the gasoline. The century-long illusion of the Americo-Liberian elite had shattered. The brief, hopeful illusion of Master Sergeant Doe's indigenous revolution was rotting from the inside out. The 1990s were approaching, and the history of Liberia was about to take a turn so complex, so surreal, and so cinematic that it would completely rewrite the geopolitical rulebook of West Africa. The man in the desert was packing his bags. His name was Charles Taylor, and he was coming back to the Pepper Coast. On Christmas Eve of 1989, while the rest of the world was wrapping gifts, singing carols, and settling in for a quiet holiday, the history of the Pepper Coast fractured entirely. Down in the dense, humid borderlands where Liberia meets the Ivory Coast, a tiny group of heavily armed men walked out of the jungle. There were only about 150 of them. They called themselves the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, and they were led by the man who had been patiently waiting in the desert. Charles Taylor did not look like a traditional revolutionary. He didn't have the rugged, hardened look of a lifelong soldier. He was a man with a degree in economics from a college in Massachusetts. He was highly educated, impeccably dressed, and spoke with a smooth, hypnotic, almost aristocratic charm. When he gave interviews to foreign journalists, he sounded less like a rebel commander and more like a university professor debating political theory. But beneath that polished exterior was an absolutely ruthless ambition. He had crossed the border with a single goal: to march down to the Atlantic Ocean, enter the executive mansion, and tear Master Sergeant Samuel Doe away from the presidency. What Charles Taylor thought would be a quick, surgical strike quickly spiraled into something else entirely. The Liberian government was so deeply unpopular, and the indigenous population was so completely exhausted by the paranoia and corruption of the 1980s, that Taylor's tiny rebel force didn't even have to fight to recruit people. As they marched through the muddy dirt roads of the interior, thousands of young, disillusioned men and teenagers simply fell into step behind them. The tiny band of 150 men swelled into an unstoppable, chaotic tide of thousands. Within months, the center of the country completely collapsed. Samuel Doe's heavily funded military, the one that had received millions of dollars from the United States, simply evaporated in the dense green of the rainforest. The rebels surrounded the capital city of Monrovia, cutting off the electricity, cutting off the water, and plunging the city into darkness. And this is where the conflict took a turn into the deeply, profoundly surreal. If you read about the Liberian Civil War in a standard history book, it reads like a dry list of shifting alliances, broken treaties, and changing front lines. But if you actually lived through it, if you were standing on the cracked pavement of Monrovia in the early 1990s, it felt like you had suddenly woken up inside a dark, cinematic fever dream. The war did not look like the wars you see in old black and white newsreels. There were no neat uniforms. There were no clear chains of command. The rebellion splintered. Almost immediately, Taylor's commanders began to argue amongst themselves, breaking off to form their own private armies. Suddenly, it wasn't a binary conflict between the government and the rebels. It was a kaleidoscope of a half-dozen different, heavily armed factions, all fighting each other in a deeply confusing, constantly shifting geopolitical puzzle. Because many of the fighters were incredibly young, swept up from isolated villages, disconnected from their families, and thrown into the absolute chaos of an urban war zone, they began to cope with the trauma in a very peculiar way. When reality becomes too terrible to comprehend, human beings often retreat into the theatrical. The warlords and their fighters began to adopt bizarre, almost cartoonish aliases. They abandoned their given names and started calling themselves things like General Mosquito, General Peanut Butter, and General Butt Naked. To an outsider listening to the news on a shortwave radio, these names sounded like a morbid joke, but to the people living through it, they were a terrifying reality. The names were designed to project an aura of invincibility, a way of shedding their old, vulnerable identities and becoming something larger than life, something untouchable. And the clothing. The clothing was perhaps the most striking, surreal visual of the entire era. Remember how, 150 years earlier, the Americo-Liberian settlers had used heavy wool coats and top hats as a kind of psychological armor against the jungle? In the 1990s, the young fighters developed their own twisted version of psychological armor. They believed that traditional military uniforms were cursed. Instead, they raided the abandoned department stores and the empty homes of the coastal elite, putting together outfits that defied all logical explanation. If you looked down a heavily contested street in Monrovia, you wouldn't see soldiers in green camouflage. You would see young men carrying heavy machine guns while wearing bright pink bathrobes. You would see fighters wearing shower caps, women's wigs, Halloween masks of American cartoon characters, and in some incredibly bizarre cases, fully beaded white bridal gowns. There was a deep, complex spiritual logic to this absolute visual chaos. Many of the fighters believed in ancient indigenous forms of magic. They believed that by wearing women's clothing or absurd costumes, they could confuse the spirits of their enemies, or that the clothing itself carried a protective charm that would make bullets simply bounce off them. It was a tragic, desperate attempt to find safety in a world that had completely lost its mind. While Monrovia was trapped in this surreal, fragmented nightmare, the rest of West Africa realized that the chaos was starting to spill over the borders. In a historic and highly unusual move, a coalition of neighboring countries, led heavily by the massive military of Nigeria, decided to intervene. They formed a multinational peacekeeping force called ICOMOG. One morning, the citizens of Monrovia looked out over the crashing waves of the Atlantic and saw a fleet of massive grey warships dropping anchor. Thousands of foreign soldiers wearing bright white helmets marched off the ships, determined to bring order to the chaos. But ICOMOG quickly discovered that you cannot simply politely ask a kaleidoscope to stop spinning. The peacekeepers didn't end the war. They simply became another piece on the board. They found themselves dragged into the surreal, shifting alliances, sometimes fighting alongside one warlord against another, trying to hold a fragile perimeter around the center of the city. Meanwhile, deep in the interior of the country, away from the coastal fighting, Charles Taylor was pulling off one of the most audacious geopolitical magic tricks in modern history. Taylor had failed to capture the capital city of Monrovia, but he controlled almost everywhere else. He controlled the dense rainforests, the winding dirt roads, and, most importantly, the massive natural resources. He decided that if he couldn't be the president of Liberia, he would simply invent his own country. He called his territory Greater Liberia, and he established a shadow capital in a provincial town called Gbanga. To understand Charles Taylor's absolute brilliance and his deep cynicism, you only have to look at how he ran this shadow state. While the actual capital of Monrovia was starving and without power, Taylor's headquarters in Gbanga was booming. He had massive generators providing 24-hour electricity. He created his own currency. He established his own banking system. He even launched his own television and radio network. He would broadcast long, smooth, perfectly enunciated speeches across the continent. He would pick up a satellite phone from deep within the African rainforest and casually negotiate trade deals with major European and Asian corporations. Because, despite the war, the world still needed what the Pepper Coast had to offer. Foreign cargo ships would quietly sail into the deep water ports controlled by Taylor's forces. They would load up millions of tons of ancient mahogany timber. They would load up the milky white latex from the massive rubber plantations, which Taylor had easily captured. And they would load up millions of dollars worth of rough diamonds, mined by forced labor in the muddy riverbeds of the interior. Charles Taylor was making hundreds of millions of dollars a year, running a completely unrecognized, illegal shadow government. He was buying enormous amounts of weapons, paying his fighters, and living like an absolute king in the middle of a war zone. He essentially turned an entire sovereign nation into a private, heavily armed corporation. As the 1990s dragged on, the sheer exhaustion of the situation began to settle over the entire region like a thick, heavy blanket of dust. The surreal aesthetic, the bizarre names, the shifting alliances, it all just became deeply, profoundly tiring. The people of Liberia were no longer terrified. They were simply exhausted. They wanted to sleep without the sound of distant artillery. They wanted to walk to a market and buy a cup of rice without having to pass through 3 different heavily armed checkpoints run by teenagers in bathrobes. The international community was exhausted too. Throughout the decade, the warlords would frequently put down their weapons, put on very expensive, tailored Italian suits, and fly to luxury 5-star hotels in cities like Geneva, Switzerland, or Abuja, Nigeria. They would sit in heavily air-conditioned conference rooms, drink bottled water, and sign grand sweeping peace treaties, while the international press took photographs. They signed over a dozen major peace agreements, and almost every single time, as soon as they flew back to the humidity of the West African coast, they would immediately tear the treaties up and start fighting all over again. The peace talks were just another form of theater, but eventually, the physical and emotional fatigue of a country reaches an absolute breaking point. By the year 1997, the international community forced a temporary, highly fragile ceasefire and organized an emergency national election. It was a desperate attempt to simply force a conclusion to the madness. Charles Taylor, having traded his military fatigues for a sharp, impeccably tailored white suit, ran for president. If you want to understand the deep, pragmatic tragedy of the Liberian voter in 1997, you only have to look at the campaign slogan that Charles Taylor's supporters chanted in the streets. It is perhaps the darkest, most brutally honest political slogan in the history of democracy. They chanted, "He killed my ma, he killed my pa, but I will vote for him." It sounds impossible. Why would a population willingly vote for the man who had initiated a decade of absolute chaos? Because they knew that if Charles Taylor lost the election, he would simply go back into the jungle and start the war all over again. He had the guns, he had the money, he had the timber and the diamonds. The people of Liberia didn't vote for him out of love. They didn't vote for him out of admiration. They voted for him because he was holding a gun to the head of the entire nation, and they just wanted the noise to stop. They were voting for quiet. They were voting for the chance to finally, simply close their eyes and rest. Charles Taylor won the presidency in a landslide. The warlords packed up their weapons, the peacekeepers packed up their tents, and the world looked away, assuming the strange, dark chapter of the Pepper Coast was finally over. But peace built on extortion is not peace. It is just a pause. Within a few short years, the quiet would shatter once again. A second, final wave of conflict would wash over the country, pushing the exhausted population to the absolute edge of despair. But in that second wave of darkness, something incredible was about to happen. The warlords, the politicians, and the international diplomats had spent 14 years failing to fix the country. They had tried bullets, they had tried treaties, and they had failed. The solution wasn't going to come from a man in a tailored suit in a luxury hotel. It was going to come from the dusty floors of a fish market. It was going to come from a group of ordinary women, dressed entirely in white, who simply stood up, linked their arms, and decided that they were not going to move until the world finally listened. By the late 1990s, the illusion of Charles Taylor's presidency had completely, predictably collapsed. The peace that the international community had so desperately tried to force upon the country had lasted barely 2 years. A new rebellion had sparked in the deep forests near the borders of Guinea and Sierra Leone. New factions, with new confusing acronyms like LURD and Model, began to march toward the capital. This was the start of the Second Liberian Civil War. But this time, the atmosphere was different. There was no surreal, chaotic energy. There were no bizarre costumes or cinematic illusions. There was only a crushing, bone-deep, absolute exhaustion. The people of Liberia felt like they were trapped inside a nightmare that was stuck on a loop. The international journalists had mostly packed up their cameras and left, deciding the story was simply too complicated and too repetitive to cover. The foreign embassies had closed their heavy iron gates. The world had effectively turned its back, leaving the Pepper Coast to drown in its own seemingly endless cycle of conflict. As the rebel factions closed in on Monrovia once again, tens of thousands of refugees poured into the city, fleeing the fighting in the interior. They had nowhere to go. They crowded into abandoned, rusting cargo ships at the port. They set up makeshift camps in the crumbling concrete of the National Sports Stadium. And to make matters worse, it was the height of the West African rainy season. If you have never experienced a tropical monsoon, it is hard to describe the sheer, oppressive weight of the water. It doesn't just rain. The sky simply opens up and drops an ocean onto the earth. The dirt roads of Monrovia turned into deep, impassable rivers of thick red mud. People were sleeping under thin sheets of plastic, shivering in the damp, listening to the heavy drumbeat of the rain against the tin roofs, waiting for the artillery shells to start falling again. The political system was completely paralyzed. Charles Taylor sat in his heavily guarded executive mansion, growing more paranoid by the day. The rebel warlords camped in the swamps outside the city, completely indifferent to the suffering of the civilians caught in the middle. It was in this atmosphere of absolute muddy despair that a woman named Lema Gbowie had a quiet, profound realization. She was a social worker, a mother, and an ordinary citizen who had spent years watching the men of her country tear it apart. She realized that the politicians, the generals, and the international diplomats had spent over a decade trying to solve the problem using the exact same tools that had created it. They were trying to solve violence with more violence, and ego with more ego. She realized that if peace was ever going to come to Liberia, it couldn't be negotiated from the top down. It had to be demanded from the bottom up. And the only people left with any true, unshakable moral authority in the country were the mothers. In a society that had been deeply fractured by ethnic violence and political tribalism, Lema Gbowie did something incredibly radical. She ignored the invisible walls. She walked into the Christian churches on Sunday mornings, standing up in front of the congregations to speak. Then she walked into the Islamic mosques on Friday afternoons, sitting with the women there. In a world desperately trying to divide them, she reminded these women of a single, unifying truth. When a bullet flies through the air, it does not ask what religion you practice. When a child starves, it does not matter what ethnic group their parents belong to. They were all mothers. They were all tired of burying their children. They were all tired of running. And so, the Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace was born. They needed a uniform. But they didn't want the camouflage of the soldiers, or the expensive suits of the politicians, or the bizarre, colorful costumes of the rebel fighters. They chose the absolute, stark opposite. They chose to wear plain, simple, blindingly white cotton t-shirts. They wore their hair tied back in white scarves. There were no political slogans printed on their shirts. There were no logos. The white clothing was a visual reset. It was a symbol of complete purity, of absolute neutrality, and of an unyielding demand for peace. One morning, as the heavy, humid heat of the sun burned away the morning mist, a few dozen women wearing white walked out of their homes. They walked past the military checkpoints, ignoring the young, heavily armed soldiers who watched them with utter confusion. They walked to an open, dusty field right next to a bustling fish market in the center of Monrovia. They chose this specific spot for a very strategic reason. The fish market sat directly on the main road that Charles Taylor had, to drive down every single day, to get from his private residence to the executive mansion. He could ignore the diplomats, and he could ignore the rebel demands, but he was going to have to look at them. The women sat down in the dirt. At first, there were only a few dozen of them. They didn't have loudspeakers. They didn't throw stones. They didn't shout angry political chants. They simply sat together, swaying back and forth, and they began to sing. They sang old spirituals, hymns, and traditional African songs of peace. Their voices blended together in a rich, deeply calming harmony that drifted over the smells of the market and the distant, mechanical sounds of the war. The next day, more women joined them, and the day after that, hundreds more. Within weeks, the dusty field beside the fish market was transformed into an absolute sea of white. Thousands of women, Christian and Muslim, young and old, educated coastal elites, and impoverished refugees from the interior, were sitting side by side in the dirt. When the blistering midday sun beat down on them, turning the air into a suffocating oven, they did not move. When the torrential monsoon rains returned, soaking their white cotton shirts and turning the field into a deep, clinging swamp of red mud, they did not move. They sat under umbrellas, they held hands, and they kept singing. It was a profound display of maternal authority. In West African culture, there is an immense, deeply rooted respect for mothers. The young soldiers driving past in their pickup trucks, gripping their machine guns, suddenly found themselves looking out at a field of women who looked exactly like their own aunts, their own grandmothers, and their own mothers. The warlords had trained these boys to fear nothing on the battlefield, but they had absolutely no defense against the quiet, disappointed gaze of a mother sitting in the rain. The pressure began to build. The women demanded a meeting with Charles Taylor. When he finally, reluctantly agreed to see them, expecting a polite, deferential request, they walked into his grand, air-conditioned office and firmly directly demanded that he attend a peace conference with the rebel leaders in the neighboring country of Ghana. The sheer, unshakable weight of their presence forced his hand. Charles Taylor, a man who had manipulated international superpowers and terrified an entire region, blinked. He agreed to go. The peace talks were scheduled to take place in Accra, the capital city of Ghana, at a luxurious, five-star hotel called the Movenpick. Once again, the tragic, familiar theater of the 1990s began to play out. The warlords, the rebel commanders, and the government officials flew out of the muddy, starving, war-torn city of Monrovia and checked into their expensive, heavily air-conditioned hotel suites. They walked across polished marble floors. They ate at massive, lavish buffet tables. They sat in plush leather chairs in the conference rooms, arguing over technicalities, trading insults, and essentially treating the peace process like a game of poker. Back in Monrovia, the fighting actually intensified. The rebels pushed into the city limits. Mortar shells were falling on the refugee camps. The situation was more desperate than ever. But the women in white were not going to let the men play their games this time. Lema Giboe and a delegation of almost 200 women managed to raise enough money to buy plane tickets. They flew to Ghana, drove to the luxury hotel, and simply sat down in the perfectly manicured, flower-lined courtyard outside the conference room. For weeks they sat there, a silent, white-clad reminder of the suffering happening back home. They watched the warlords walk past them every morning on their way to the buffet, completely ignoring the women in the courtyard. The peace talks stalled. The men were refusing to compromise. And then one afternoon, Lema Giboe decided that the time for polite, quiet protest had officially ended. She gathered the women. They stood up, walked into the grand, beautifully decorated lobby of the hotel, and marched directly toward the heavy glass doors of the main conference room, where all the warlords, diplomats, and politicians were sitting. The women linked their arms together, forming a solid human barricade across the doors. They sat down on the marble floor. They locked the men inside. The atmosphere in the hotel instantly shifted from luxurious boredom to absolute panic. The warlords inside the room realized they couldn't leave. The international mediators were stunned. The hotel security guards, completely unsure of how to handle 200 peaceful singing mothers, rushed forward and tried to forcefully pull the women away from the doors. It was in this chaotic, terrifying moment that Lima Gaboe played her final, most powerful card. As the guards grabbed her arms, trying to drag her across the floor, she reached up and began to untie the scarf holding her hair. Then she slowly began to unbutton her blouse. To a Western listener, this might just sound like an act of desperate protest. But in deeply traditional West African culture, what she was threatening to do was the absolute, most terrifying taboo imaginable. For a mother to deliberately strip her clothes off in public, in front of men who are old enough to be her sons, is considered a profound, earth-shattering curse. It is a spiritual declaration that the men have so completely failed in their duty to protect society that they are no longer worthy of looking upon the women who gave them life. The effect was instantaneous, and it was absolute. A prominent mediator inside the room practically threw himself against the glass, screaming at the guards to stop touching her, begging her not to take off her clothes. The warlords inside the conference room, men who had ordered executions and commanded armies of child soldiers, literally turned their faces to the wall, covering their eyes in absolute terror. They were trapped. The women outside the door sent a very simple message through the glass. We are not moving. You do not get to come out to eat. You do not get to come out to sleep. You are going to sit in that room until you sign a piece of paper that brings peace to our country. The standoff lasted for hours. The polished, gentlemanly illusions of the politicians were completely shattered by the raw, unyielding reality of the mothers who had finally had enough. And it worked. The sheer psychological pressure broke the deadlock. The men sat back down at the heavy wooden tables. They stopped arguing over egos and titles. The international community, deeply embarrassed by the fact that it took a group of unarmed women sitting on a marble floor to force their hand, finally stepped up and applied real, heavy diplomatic pressure. They drafted a comprehensive peace agreement. It required the rebel factions to completely disarm. It established a transitional government. And, most importantly, it required Charles Taylor to permanently leave the presidency and go into exile. Back in Monrovia, the heavy, dark clouds of the monsoon season were finally beginning to break. On August 11, 2003, Charles Taylor stood on the tarmac of the international airport in Monrovia. He was wearing his signature white suit, but the aura of invincibility was completely gone. He looked out at the thick, green jungle that he had controlled for so long. He climbed the stairs to a waiting jet. The heavy metal door closed behind him, and the engines roared to life. As the plane lifted off the runway, banking out over the deep indigo waters of the Atlantic Ocean, the era of the warlords officially came to an end. The women back at the fish market, their white shirts stained with the red mud of the Pepper Coast, stood up and wept. The 14-year nightmare, a conflict that had taken hundreds of thousands of lives and completely shattered a nation, was finally over. The silence that settled over the city that night wasn't the terrified, paranoid silence of the past. It was the deep, pure, quiet silence of a storm that had finally passed. When you have lived inside a state of emergency for 14 years, the sudden arrival of peace does not feel like an explosion of joy. It feels like waking up from a terrible dream, sitting on the edge of your bed, and simply breathing in the quiet room. The morning after Charles Taylor flew away into exile, the sun rose over the Pepper Coast, just as it had for thousands of years. But as the golden light caught the rusting tin roofs of Monrovia and reflected off the deep puddles of monsoon rain, the people of Liberia stepped out of their homes with a strange, unfamiliar sensation. They didn't have to listen for the sound of distant artillery. They didn't have to check the horizon for columns of black smoke. The invisible, crushing weight that had sat on the chest of the nation for over a decade was simply gone. Of course, a country does not heal overnight. The physical scars of the war were everywhere. The grand, brutalist executive mansion was pockmarked with bullet holes. The power grid was completely destroyed. The massive rubber plantations had grown wild and tangled, and the deep dirt roads of the interior were completely washed out. Liberia was a broken mirror, shattered into a million tiny pieces. But for the very first time in its incredibly strange, turbulent history, the people were finally ready to pick up those pieces and put them back together, not as Americo-Liberians, and not as fractured indigenous tribes, but simply as Liberians. The United Nations sent in a massive, heavily funded peacekeeping force to ensure the warlords handed over their weapons. For 2 years, an interim government slowly, painstakingly cleared the rubble from the streets. And then, in the late autumn of 2005, the true ultimate victory of the women in white finally arrived. It was time for a national election. And this time, there were no warlords holding a gun to the head of the voters. If you had walked through the streets of Monrovia on election day, you would have witnessed a profoundly moving scene. Hundreds of thousands of people stood in lines that stretched for miles, winding through the muddy streets, past the ruins of old colonial buildings, and down toward the beaches. The equatorial sun was absolutely punishing. The humidity was suffocating. Yet, nobody complained. Nobody left the line. They stood there for hours, holding small paper voting cards. Old men leaning on wooden walking sticks. Young people who had only ever known the chaos of war. And of course, the women in their plain white cotton shirts. When the paper ballots were finally counted by hand, under the flicker of kerosene lanterns, the result echoed across the entire continent of Africa. The people of Liberia had elected Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. She was a Harvard-educated economist, a grandmother, and a woman who had been imprisoned by the military dictatorships of the past. More importantly, she made history as the very first democratically elected female head of state on the entire African continent. It was a beautiful, poetic conclusion to a deeply painful chapter. The men of Liberia had spent a century and a half building pyramids of power, wearing top hats and military fatigues, and fighting over the right to rule. In the end, it was the mothers who forced the peace, and it was a grandmother who was chosen to clean up the mess. Under President Sirleaf, who affectionately became known as the Iron Lady, the Pepper Coast slowly began to breathe again. The rebuilding was not a magical, overnight success. It was slow, frustrating, and incredibly difficult work. But slowly, the electricity began to return, street by street. The massive international debt that had choked the country for decades was forgiven. The children, thousands of whom had been robbed of their youth by the rebel factions, put down their heavy rifles and put on crisp, clean school uniforms. And out in the deep green interior, the natural world began its own quiet process of healing. The African rainforest is an incredibly resilient force. It does not hold on to the past. Within a few short years, the rusted, abandoned military checkpoints on the dirt highways were completely swallowed by thick green vines. The massive mahogany trees stretched their canopies toward the sun, casting deep, cool shadows over the forest floor. The wild, deafening symphony of the jungle, the cicadas, the calling birds, the rustling monkeys, returned to its ancient, uninterrupted rhythm. Even the massive Firestone rubber plantation, which had seen so much of the country's complex history, found a new equilibrium. The trees were carefully pruned, the neat geometric rows were restored, and the milky white sap began to drip, drop by drop, into the little ceramic cups once more. Only this time, under the watchful eyes of labor unions and fair trade agreements. Today, if you take a flight across the Atlantic Ocean, tracing the exact same path that the wooden ship Elizabeth took over 200 years ago, and land on the tarmac outside of Monrovia, you will step into a deeply vibrant, chaotic, and beautiful modern city. The culture shock is still there, but it is a joyful one. The heavy, oppressive top hats and corsets of the 19th century settlers are completely gone, relegated to the dusty glass cases of history museums. In their place is a spectacular explosion of color. The streets of the capital are filled with people wearing brilliantly dyed West African wax prints, bright yellows, deep indigos, and rich emerald greens. The markets are a sensory overload of life. The air smells of roasting plantains, spicy cassava leaf stew, and the sharp, salty tang of the ocean breeze. You can hear the booming, rhythmic bass of Afrobeats music playing from the open doors of barbershops and cafes, blending perfectly with the constant, cheerful honking of yellow taxicabs navigating the busy intersections. It is a city that carries its scars with a quiet, enduring dignity. If you look closely at the walls of the older buildings, you can still see the faded indentations of the war. The country still faces profound challenges with poverty, infrastructure, and the slow march of development. But the absolute defining characteristic of the modern Liberian spirit is a profound, unshakable resilience. They have survived the deep blue of the ocean. They have survived the terrifying fevers of the frontier. They have survived the crushing weight of prejudice, the arrogance of empires, and the chaotic nightmares of the warlords. They have earned their peace. And as our long journey through the surreal, twisting history of the Pepper Coast finally comes to a close, the sun is beginning to set over Monrovia. Imagine yourself standing on one of the high, rocky bluffs overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The punishing heat of the equatorial day has finally broken, giving way to a soft, cooling evening breeze that rustles gently through the wide, green fronds of the palm trees. The sky above the water is putting on a spectacular, quiet show. The bright, blinding blue deepens into a bruised purple, streaked with vibrant bands of burnt orange and soft, dusty pink. The horizon blurs, melting the sky and the ocean together into an endless, calming expanse. Down below, the city is beginning to settle. The frantic energy of the markets slows to a comfortable hum. The yellow taxis turn their headlights on, casting long, sweeping beams through the gathering dusk. In the neighborhoods, families are sitting on their porches, enjoying the cool air, sharing the evening meal, and speaking in the low, rhythmic cadence of Liberian English. Out over the dark water, the very first stars are beginning to appear. They are the exact same stars that the 88 passengers of the Elizabeth looked up at as they drifted across the unknown ocean 2 centuries ago. Those early settlers were looking for a home. They were looking for a place where they could simply exist, in peace, without the heavy burden of history constantly pressing down on their shoulders. It took 200 years of struggle, of terrible mistakes, of profound heartbreak, and of unimaginable courage to finally find it. But tonight, beneath that vast, glittering canopy of stars, the Pepper Coast is finally at rest. The history has been written. The ghosts of the past have retreated into the shadows of the ancient mahogany trees. The long, complex story of Liberia has found its quiet chapter. As the gentle, rhythmic sound of the Atlantic waves crashing against the bright, sandy beach fills the night air, I want you to let that rhythm wash over you. Let the steady, ancient heartbeat of the ocean pull you deeper and deeper into relaxation. Notice the feeling of the blankets resting softly against your shoulders. Feel the heavy, comfortable weight of your own body sinking effortlessly into the mattress. You don't need to carry the weight of the day anymore. You don't need to worry about the future or analyze the past. Right now, in this exact moment, there is absolutely nothing you need to do, and nowhere else you need to be. Take one final, slow, deep breath in, filling your lungs with calm, peaceful energy, and let it all the way out, releasing any last, lingering tension into the dark. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey tonight. Until next time, wherever you are in the world, sleep well and good night.